Welcome to Issues and Insiders. My name is David Bass. I'm education reporter with Carolina Journal. Today I got a chance to sit down with Brad Wilcox. Brad is a professor at the University of Virginia. He is also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for Family Studies. Brad is a nationally known expert on marriage and family issues, and he joined us today to discuss those two issues, marriage and family in North Carolina, and several policy recommendations for the General Assembly on how to strengthen both of those. All right, well, Brad, welcome to North Carolina.
Good to be here, David.
Have you on the show.
Thank you.
First, I'd just love to hear your kind of take on broadly marriage and two-parent households in North Carolina right now.
Yeah.
Where does the state stand kind of nationally? Are we leading,
Sure.
middle of the pack, kind of lagging? What's the status there?
Yeah, when it comes to kind of marriage, you've seen kind of the share of North Carolinians, married move from about 2/3 in 1960 to just less than 50% today. And that's pretty typical for where the country, David, as a whole stands. But when you kind of look at the share of kids who are living in single-parent families, North Carolina is above average. About a third of North Carolinian kids or Tar Heel kids are living in single-parent families. Well, that's come down a little bit in the last year or two. I think that's because a lot of married families have been moving to North Carolina. So that's one sort of interesting change we've seen just play out in the last year or two here in the state.
Interesting. Okay. Now, I know you're big about strengthening marriage and family. In our culture today, a lot of people might wonder, why does marriage matter anymore? Why do two-parent families matter for children, for society broadly? How do you address that question?
Yeah, I think, it's just kind of important to realize, as Aristotle said, we are social animals. Social animals. And we kind of are most likely to flourish when we have good friendships and good families. And sort of marriage is kind of like the most important friendship most of us have, and certainly the most important family relationship most of us have. So when our marriages are strong, we're more likely to be flourishing, emotionally and socially. Of course, financially, it's also the case too that married folks are just much more likely to be able to pull income together today, oftentimes, and to accumulate assets in ways that kind of put them, in a better bracket. And then kind of from the statewide perspective, what we see is that states that have more married parent families in the mix are more likely to be prosperous, to have higher growth rates, to have lower child poverty, and to have the American dream kind of functioning at a better level. So when there are more two-parent families in the state, we see that, for instance, to be concrete about the American dream point, that kids from poor families are more likely to rise as adults into the upper class. It's one of the strongest predictors of kind of the strength of this American dream story from poverty to riches for poor kids, is the share of two-parent families in the state. So these are some of the reasons why, North Carolinians should be thinking about the strength of the family here in this state.
Yeah, excellent. Now, I know you have several policy recommendations for state governments, including the state government in North Carolina, on how to strengthen marriage and family. The first of those is kind of on the big tech issue, and particularly as that it relates to social media use among minors and some regulations around that. Could you kind of explain what the recommendation is?
Well, just to kind of give you a quick background here. When we've been talking with parents around the U.S., what we have found is kind of the number one issue they raise with us is their difficulties, their struggles with smartphones and teens. And so as we've then looked at the empirical research and done research on this, we find that basically there's a strong association between lots of time on social media and thoughts of suicide, reports of self-harm, anxiety, depression, all this kind of stuff seems to be kind of linked to the rise of social media in the lives of our kids. We have seen, for instance, across the U.S., that the number of teenage girls that are being admitted for self-harm has more than doubled since 2010. So that's just kind of one indication of like how this is sort of impacting real kids, especially girls in the country. So in terms of North Carolina, we're suggesting is that you guys have just age verified pornography, which is great, and just to kind of extend that approach to social media. And we've seen that play out in other states like Utah, for instance. So what's going to happen in Utah starting next year is that kids who are on social media are going to have to be getting permission from their parents to stay on those platforms. They're also going to have a curfew from 10:30 at night to 6:30 that will kind of keep those platforms dark, for children. they're going to basically make it easier for families who've seen some kind of harm play out in their kids' lives, make it easier for them to sue big tech. So these are the kinds of measures that have been incorporated into Utah law and some extent also in Texas and Arkansas. And we think that North Carolina should kind of follow in their lead to kind of give Tar Heel parents more power to basically keep things like, TikTok and Instagram and YouTube Shorts kind of either off their kids' phones or kind of under greater control for them as parents.
Now, another recommendation you have is to create a commission on boys and men. What would that look like, and why would that be necessary?
So I was talking to a group of parents last night from North Carolina, and they were just commenting, on how when they kind of go to those middle school award ceremonies, they see that girls are kind of far outperforming boys, and that's just the kind of thing you see today. You hear about today from parents that for any number of reasons, girls are just doing much better in our schools than boys. And this sort of gender gap that's emerged in our schools is problematic because it means that our boys are less well prepared to go to college if that's in their future, or go directly into a job, and that are also more likely to be floundering, in the workforce in their 20s. And that in turn matters because young men who don't do well, in terms of their jobs are financially worse off, but also just even emotionally worse off. And of course, they're less marriageable too. They're less attractive as husbands and fathers. So we think that the state should be thinking about how do we kind of bridge this gender gap, in our schools and labor force and colleges across the state of North Carolina. What are some strategies to make schools more boy-friendly? I think, for instance, we should have more single-sex schools across the state, but also more recess, more male teachers. Thinking about measures like that, and then also begin to think about giving teenage males and young men a kind of more pro-social model of masculinity that is marriage and father-friendly. What we're seeing, unfortunately, right now is that online, a lot of the biggest influencers, like Andrew Tate, who's a big manosphere guy, are giving a very kind of misogynistic message to our teenage boys and young men, a very anti-marriage message as well. And so the state might think about some PSAs that would kind of give young men, teenage boys, a more constructive, more pro-social model of masculinity to identify with as they are moving into adulthood.
I know another objective is to try to make it more affordable for North Carolinians to have a family. And part of that was this idea of a state tax credit. Could you explain some about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people today are sort of looking at the bills that they incur from raising the next generation, having kids, and it just seems pretty daunting to have one kid or two or three children. And so I think as we look at kind of the challenges that working and middle-class families face in the state, we should be thinking about basically a child allowance or a family credit that would give working families, in that sort of middle bracket, broadly defined, like $1,000 child allowance that they could use to help cover the costs of food, education, the care of the young, and we're targeting families with kids under the age of 5 to kind of really focus on that stage in life where, parents are kind of often struggling to, pay all the bills associated with having young children.
Right. Now, I know a lot of your work is built around something that's called the success sequence. Could you just briefly explain kind of what the success sequence is? And then I know there's an effort to educate children, including in North Carolina, about what the success sequence is. So could you explain that?
Yeah, so really there are kind of 3 pillars to economic success in America today, and those 3 pillars are education, work, and marriage. And yet we've seen a decline, especially for young men in work, and a decline for both young men and young women in marriage. And obviously a growing number of kids in North Carolina have been, are being born outside of marriage or raised outside of marriage. And so what the success sequence does is it kind of just tells them that there's a path that maximizes their odds of realizing the American dream financially. And that pathway is getting at least a high school degree, working full-time in their early 20s, and getting married before having children. So as against education, work, and marriage are the 3 pillars of a strong, financial foundation for young adults. And for young adults who do those 3 things, they have just a 3% chance of being poor in their late 20s and 30s. And the vast majority of them will reach the middle class or higher in their late 20s and 30s. So what we like to do is to teach kids about the value of the sequence, especially the value of work and marriage today, given that those things have kind of sagged to some extent. And to do that in a winsome and compelling way, and to teach them, for instance, that your odds of being very happy, for instance, as an adult are twice as high if you're married, that your odds of your kids being poor are about 3 to 4 times lower if you are married compared to being a single parent. So kind of just to give our kids in this state sort of a sense of how much work and marriage especially give them a shot at flourishing financially and then just flourishing in life more generally.
Great. And the idea then is that here in North Carolina that could be worked into some curriculum.
So the State Board of Education could put that into the state standards for education. You could have school districts across the state incorporating the success sequence. And also think it'd be great, given how much time our kids today on average spend on screens, to have some kind of social media work being done to kind of promote the success sequence so that kids are getting this message not just in a classroom, but also in the virtual world as well.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, there's some exciting news on February 13th next year, 2024. You're coming out with a new book just in time for Valentine's Day. It's called Get Married. Tell us about that. What's the thesis? Why did you write it? That sort of thing.
Yeah, Dave, we live in a weird moment where I think many on the left, kind of the mainstream left in the media and in the academy where I work and elsewhere, have been kind of like discounting or denying the value of marriage. They've kind of been encouraging folks to focus on their careers and earning money or just having freedom from the obligations of family life. And now we're actually seeing that same kind of message that's being articulated on the sort of the online right from the sort of manosphere people like Andrew Tate, like I mentioned before. So kind of from the left and the right, we're seeing more voices kind of like basically discouraging young adults from getting married, and also kind of sending messages that I think aren't particularly helpful, for couples who are already married to kind of give it their best and to flourish. So my book, Get Married, from HarperCollins, is designed to kind of explain how it is that marriage done well maximizes your odds of happiness. What I find in this new book is that nothing kind of predicts adult happiness like a good marriage. Not money, not education, not a good career, not sexual frequency. I've thrown all the variables in the model, and the number one factor that I see is a good marriage in terms of predicting people's sense of happiness. So kind of letting them appreciate how much kind of investing in marriage and family matters for them, and for obviously for any kids that they have, but then also kind of reminding us that strong families are the foundation of thriving communities. And whether you look at things like crime, incarceration, as I said before, the American dream, what you see is that communities that have stronger families are much more likely to be places people want to live, places people are flourishing, and we can and should do more to strengthen this most fundamental institution in our country. So that's what this book is about.
Well, Brad Wilcox, thank you for joining us today on Issues and Insiders. Great to chat with you.
Thanks, David. I appreciate the time.